United Nations is broke, not metaphorically, actually broke. Secretary General Antonio Guterres sent a letter to all 193 member states this week warning of a, quote, imminent financial collapse. The UN ended 2025 with a record $1.57 billion in outstanding dues, more than double what it was owed the year before. Cash could run out by July. Here's the kicker. The UN is trapped in what Guterres calls a Kafkaesque cycle. Under its financial rules, the organization has to give back the unspent money to member states, even when it never received that money in the first place. Either all member states honor their obligations to pay in full and on time, Guterres wrote, or member states must fundamentally overhaul our financial rules. The translation, pay up or just let it die. The elephant in the room? The United States owes roughly $2.2 billion, including $767 million from this year's assessment alone. The Trump administration didn't pay any UN dues last year. Not a dime. The U.S. Ambassador Mike Waltz made the strategy crystal clear. The days of blank checks to the UN are over, he said, quote. But the money crisis is just a symptom. The real disease? Decades of American actions that have systematically undermined the very institution that it helped create. The UN isn't collapsing because of it's collapsing because the Western model of humanitarian intervention has been exposed as regime change propaganda, and the rest of the world is done pretending otherwise. Let's start with Iraq, the illegal war that changed everything. In March 2003, the United States invades Iraq without Security Council authorization. UN Secretary Kofi Annan would later call it illegal. Quote, from our point of view, from the charter point of view, it was illegal, Annan told the BBC in 2004. The US and UK tried to get a second Security Council resolution explicitly authorizing force. France, Russia, and China made it clear they would veto it. So the US simply withdrew the proposal and invaded anyway. They couldn't even get 9 votes for it. Over 500,000 Iraqis died. The region descended into chaos. ISIS emerged from the wreckage. And the message was clear. When America decides it wants war, the UN is irrelevant. Now let's go to Libya. March 2011. NATO launches what it calls a humanitarian intervention under the UN Security Council Resolution 1973. The resolution authorized protecting civilians, not regime change. So within weeks, Obama, Cameron, and Sarkozy released joint statements saying civilian protection was impossible without removing Gaddafi. They turned a no-fly zone into a 7-month bombing campaign that ended with Gaddafi killed and Libya in ruins. Libya's fragility score increased 28 points between 2011 and 2021. It went from 111th to the 17th most fragile state in the world. But here's what actually happened. NATO's intervention magnified the conflict's duration about 6-fold and its death toll at least 7-fold. The Harvard Belfer Center found that Gaddafi wasn't conducting indiscriminate attacks on civilians. The humanitarian crisis was rebel propaganda designed to trigger the intervention. After Gaddafi fell, up to 15,000 man-portable surface-to-air missiles from his arsenal flooded that region. Weapons ended up in the hands of jihadists and other groups across northern Africa and the Sahel. Libya had one of the highest per capita incomes in Africa before the intervention. Free healthcare, free education. Now it's a failed state crawling with militias and slave markets. Now let's talk about Syria. Here's what they don't tell you about Syria. Operation Timber Sycamore was a CIA covert program that began in 2012 to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Obama secretly authorized it. The goal, explicitly, was regime change. The CIA worked to achieve policy outcomes rather than secure domestic Syrian interests or spread democracy, according to the declassified analysis. The program costs about $1 billion a year, making it one of the CIA's largest covert operations ever. The CIA, working with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and the UK, funneled weapons to Syrian rebels through Jordan and Turkey. Thousands of fighters were trained and billions in weapons flowed. Missiles and small arms did indeed fall into the hands of ISIS, according to intelligence reports. Some partner forces subscribed to the very jihadist ideologies that the US forces were supposedly there to eliminate. The Rat Line ran weapons from Libya, destroyed by NATO in 2011, to jihadists in Syria. As Seymour Hersh documented, funding came from Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, while the CIA, with support from the UK, was responsible for getting arms from Gaddafi's arsenals into Syria. The Modern War Institute at West Point called Timber Sycamore the epitome of all that went wrong with U.S. policy in Syria. The program effectively fueled a destructive civil war that accelerated the emergence of jihadist arms groups. Trump finally ended it in 2017, but by then, 500,000 Syrians were already dead. And the punchline? The rebels who finally topped Assad in December 2024 came from the more extreme Salafi jihadist factions affiliated with Timber Sycamore. The new leader, Ayman al-Sharaa, previously went by Abu Mohammed al-Jolani, founder of al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate. So when Russia and China vetoed Western resolutions on Syria, they weren't blocking humanitarian aid. They were blocking another Libya. They watched NATO turn a civilian-protected mandate into a regime change in 2011. They weren't going to let it happen again. Then we move on to Cuba. Every single year since 1992, the UN General Assembly has voted to condemn the U.S. embargo on Cuba. Every single year. In 2024, the vote was 187 to 2. Only the U.S. and Israel voted against lifting it. That's 33 consecutive votes. The entire international community calling the embargo illegal. The U.S. response? Ignore it completely. The embargo cost Cuba $7.5 billion between March 2024 and February 2025. During COVID-19, Cuba couldn't import ventilators. Infant mortality, once below 5 per 100,000, hit 8.5. The European Union votes to end it. The African Union votes to end it. The Asian and G77 and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Everyone votes to end it. And the U.S. keeps it going anyway. What's the point of the UN if the world's most powerful member can ignore 33 straight years of near unanimous votes? Now let's move to Gaza. Since 1972, the United States has used its veto power 49 times to shield Israel from Security Council resolutions. Just in 2024, the U.S. vetoed 4 ceasefire resolutions during Israel's war in Gaza. In November 2024, the U.S. was the only country to veto a ceasefire. 14 Security Council members voted yes. 1 voted no. Saudi Arabia, speaking of the Gulf Cooperation Council, said the U.S. veto was an obstacle to ending the bloodshed. China called for countries to put aside geostrategic considerations. South Africa condemned the use of starvation as a weapon of war. And the U.S. just keeps vetoing. The world watches as hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are dead and injured. The Security Council does nothing because one country says so. Now you have Venezuela. January 2026, the Trump administration announces the naval blockade of Venezuela. International law is unambiguous. A blockade is an act of aggression under the UN Charter. Article 3C, the UN General Assembly definition of aggression, specifically lists the blockade of the ports or coasts of a state as aggression. But the U.S. doesn't care. Brookings note that while the Security Council could rule on this, the United States and the United Kingdom have veto power, making accountability highly improbable. U.S. sanctions since 2017 caused an 80% economic contraction in Venezuela, the largest peacetime collapse in recorded history. 8 million Venezuelans fled the country. When the ICJ ruled in 1986 that the U.S. support for the Contras in Nicaragua violated international law, the U.S. simply stopped recognizing the ICJ jurisdiction. Nicaragua's UN representatives said the fight is our fight. Cuba's delegate called it imperialist and fascist aggression. And the pattern is clear. The U.S. imposes sanctions, blockades, and military operations regardless of international law. And when challenged, it refuses to recognize international courts. So do you notice the pattern? Libya, humanitarian intervention becomes regime change, country destroyed. Syria, billion-dollar CIA program arms jihadists for regime change, country destroyed. Iraq, invasion based on lies, country destroyed. Yemen, sell weapons to Saudi, bombing civilians, country destroyed. Every time the script is the same. Number 1, identify a dictator who needs removing. Number 2, amplify real or fabricated human rights abuses. 3, fund opposition groups, often extremists. 4, call it supporting democracy. 5, when that fails, just bomb. And 6, leave behind a failed state. And number 7, finally, act shocked when it becomes a terrorist haven. The global south isn't stupid. They've watched this playbook now for decades. That's why the U.S. lectures about rules-based international order. The rest of the world is beginning to laugh. And yes, Russia and China abuse their veto power. Russia has blocked action on Ukraine. China has shielded Myanmar. But there's a crucial difference. Russia and China don't pretend to be the guardians of a rules-based international order while systematically violating those rules. They don't lecture the world about democracy and human rights while bombing countries without UN authorization. They don't claim moral authority while protecting client states committing atrocity. The United States of America does. American exceptionalism means that the UN matters, except when it constrains American power. Then it doesn't matter at all. That hypocrisy is what makes U.S. behavior so corrosive. Russia and China pursue their interests openly, and at least they're honest about it. The U.S. wraps imperialism in a humanitarian rhetoric and wonders why nobody believes it anymore. So here's what the UN crisis is really about. The West's monopoly over humanitarian intervention narrative is over. For 30 years, the U.S. and its allies have used the UN to legitimize regime change dressed up as humanitarian mission. They'll find a dictator they didn't like, fund opposition movements, cry genocide, and then either invade or sanction the country into collapse. It worked in the 1990s. It worked in the 2000s. It doesn't work anymore. Libya exposed the scam. The West said, protect civilians, and then spent 7 months bombing Gaddafi until he was dead. China, Russia watched, and they learned their lesson. Syria confirmed it. The West tried the same playbook. Russia and China said no. They'd rather be called dictator enablers than fall for this humanitarian scamming. Now countries like China, Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa, and most of the global South simply don't believe Western concern for human rights. They see it for what it is, a pretext for maintaining their hegemony. The UN was useful when it could be weaponized against the enemies and ignored when it constrained friends. But now that countries are calling that double standard, the US would rather let the institution die than submit it to actual law. So what happens if the UN collapses? Technically, the UN can't be dissolved without unanimous member agreement. In reality, it doesn't need to dissolve to become irrelevant. If funding dries up, the UN UN might have closed its headquarters in New York or cancel the September General Assembly. Peacekeeping missions would collapse. Humanitarian operations would shut down. The Security Council would become a zombie institution, legally alive but functionally dead. And what replaces it? Well, probably nothing. We'd enter an era of naked power politics. The strong would do what they'd want, and the weak would suffer. But here's the thing. That's kind of already the world we live in. The UN just provided the illusion that there were rules, that powerful countries could be held accountable, that international law mattered. That illusion is gone.